My name is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today is Friday, August 13th, and today I'd like to talk about a topic that no one has requested. It's a topic that I myself want to talk about based on my experience as a Christian teacher with over 20 years now of full-time teaching experience, and it's a problem that I see that I really would like to encourage Christians to address and overcome. I was trying to think of a clever title, but I think it's best if I just state the issue plainly and say that Christians need to stop pretending. Christians need to stop pretending. And when I say Christians need to stop pretending, I mean that we need to stop pretending to be Christians. Stop pretending to be Christians. We have to choose whether we are the Christians or whether we just want to pretend to be Christians. Whether we really are the Christians of our generation or whether we're just content to pretend to be Christians. And this applies in all different areas. When we look back through church history, we look at the saints. We look in the Old Testament and we see the prophets. Unfortunately, many Catholics don't even know the stories of the prophets, even though the lives of the prophets were fundamental to the monastic life in the Catholic Church. Few take the time to read the scriptures and study the lives of the prophets, the life of Moses, the life of Samuel, the life of David and Solomon, of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Elijah and Elisha, and the rest. The lives of these prophets are largely unknown. Even the lives of patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the sons of Jacob, most famously Joseph. Few Catholics know these stories. And in these stories we find examples of true believers, men who in their generation followed God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, sacrificed everything, put all their eggs in one basket, and were willing to suffer anything that God required of them, considering it to be worth the reward. And then when we go to the life of Christ, we see in Christ, obviously, the fullness of the Godhead in bodily form. As Scripture says, we see the incarnate Word, God's will made flesh, living before the eyes of the people around him. Imagine seeing God's will in the flesh. Everything done according to God's will, every word according to God's will, every action. His daily routine was the perfect human routine within God's will. Everything he did and said was perfect. And there were people who had the opportunity to watch and follow that life. We can read about it at least the important parts, that the apostles who were with him, who lived with him, who ate with him, who slept with him, who walked and traveled with him, who watched him, watched his every move, heard his every word, the accounts that they themselves wrote for us. We can study the life of Christ, and what we see is a man who is just all in. It's God's will and nothing else. And then we look to the lives of the apostles who followed Jesus as his disciples, but then took over as the leaders of the church. And all of them, except for the Apostle John, ended up giving their lives for Christ. St. John was apparently spared of that end, but he himself spent time in prison and lived many years in God's will. But these were men who lived the Christian life. And then we go through the church fathers and all of the saints who gave their testimonies during times of persecution, real persecution, not imaginary persecution like people talk about today. Not being denied government benefits and calling that persecution. We're talking about persecution where if you confess to be a Christian, you get thrown to the lions or put to death. Real persecution. You choose Christ or your life. These men we read about, the saints all through history, these were the men and women who in their generation chose to be the Christians in their generation. They chose to be the ones who taught the truth, who lived the truth, who imitated Christ, and who suffered whatever was necessary, whatever that faith brought them into, they accepted it. Now, what's different about that true and authentic Christianity and mere pretending is that those people were Christians first. Their first concern was eternal life. And this is related to the supernatural virtue of hope. We read in the Catechism that hope, first of all, is a desire for heaven. A desire for heaven. When people are filled with the grace of hope, they desire heaven. They're not interested in a Christianity that offers them earthly benefits, temporal benefits. They desire heaven. They desire the ultimate prize. They don't want a pain-free life on earth. They want eternal life in the presence of God. They don't want a wealthy temporal life. They want eternal life. Many Christians see Christianity as a means of obtaining a happy earthly life. They already have a plan for what they're going to do. They already have a way of life that they prefer. They already have activities they like. They already have ideas they like. They're not looking for direction of how to live. They're looking for some kind of superficial benefit that can be added to that life, maybe to make it more pleasant or richer, or to add some ceremony to what would otherwise be a boring life. They pretend to be Christians for the sake of some benefit. but they don't desire the real benefit. As I said, the saints and the martyrs and the prophets, they started with Christianity and they identified as Christians. They wanted to imitate Christ. And they started with their life as with a blank sheet of paper. And they allowed Christ's teaching to fill that paper and tell them how to live, what they should do, what kind of works they should do, what their relationships should look like, how they should use their time, the kind of people they should associate with, what kind of people they should be, what things they should be interested in and what things they should not be interested in. They allowed Christ's own teaching to fill out that sheet of paper and establish for them a Christian life. And within that life, they sought to obtain the things that they needed: food, clothing, shelter. Simple things. Because in possessing the Christian life, they possessed everything that they wanted. The other things were necessities, things that they had to do, that they didn't necessarily want to do, but had to. They were Christians first, and everything else was chosen in light of their Christian life, which was established first. In modern society, Christianity has lost much of its strength, much of its influence. It's lost its saltiness, to use an illustration that Jesus gave. The light of the world is no longer shining like a lighthouse or like stars in a black night sky, but it's indistinguishable from other bodies. It's no brighter. In fact, sometimes it's even dimmer than sources that are not Christian. And this is because Christians are pretending. They're not seeking to be truly Christian. They're seeking to be minimally Christian. They're like the rich young ruler who already has his mind made up about how he's going to live, who comes to Christ and asks, "What must I do to be saved?" And when Christ tells him what he must do to be saved, he says, "No thanks. That's not what I'm interested in. I thought you were going to say something else." If we look around at Christian culture, we find lots of acting, pretending. There's lots of appearances. But when we look for the real works of the Christian life, we don't find them. And when I talk about this, I'm not talking about the clergy, because the clergy's work is actually quite simple. The work of the clergy is very systematic and organized. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room. There's not a whole lot of confusion about what the clergy should do. And if we're honest, we'll admit that the clergy is actually doing what they're supposed to do. Priests are celebrating and offering the Mass, administering the sacraments. That's what priests are supposed to do. They're priests. They're not supposed to start schools. They're not supposed to run hospitals. They're not supposed to run orphanages. They're not supposed to build or fund monasteries. We don't need priests to do these things. We need priests to administer the sacraments. That's what priests are. And in the church we have bishops, and bishops have their jobs. And our bishops are doing their jobs. The Holy Father is doing his job. For all the complaining and talking about the clergy, it's usually lay people who are not doing their jobs and who are frustrated because they can't have the things that they desire, which they really don't desire sincerely because they're not willing to work for them themselves. And so they imagine that the clergy is supposed to provide these things for them, and that they're simply supposed to use them. And their desire to use them, they pretend is some kind of virtue. Just the fact that I desire to send my son to some school that I can imagine. I can imagine this big, beautiful boarding school filled with monks and wise teachers and libraries and a beautiful ornate chapel and sports fields and classrooms, all beautifully designed and decorated. Beautiful music fills the whole school campus. You see, I want to send my son there, therefore I'm good. But the clergy doesn't provide that school, therefore the clergy is bad. That's the attitude of modern Catholics. Their lazy desire, they imagine to be their virtue. But they imagine that the clergy is supposed to provide this for them. They merely want to pretend to be Christians. They don't really want to be the Christians of their generation. Imagine St. Francis of Assisi, who, by the way, was not a priest. Imagine St. Francis before he was St. Francis, when he was just Francis. Imagine him going through his conversion experience as a young man and wanting to devote his life to the way of the gospel. Again, he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a seminarian, there was nothing for him to sign up for, no group for him to join. He had an idea of a life, of a quality of life that he wanted to live. And yet there was no place for him to go to live that life. There was no institution already created. There was no scholarship program ready for him to apply to. There was nothing that offered what he believed was necessary. And so what did he do? He simply lived the life that he believed he was supposed to live. He did the works that he believed he was supposed to do. And over time, his way, the way that he actually lived, attracted other men who shared his convictions. And so a band of brothers gathered around Francis, and they established a community, a way of life, devoted to certain works, devoted to the gospel, as he said, without interpretation, a simple and literal imitation of the life of Christ as we read of it in the text of the Gospels. But it's important for us to see that Francis was not a priest. He started everything himself, paid every cost, made every sacrifice, and just did the work that he claimed God wanted him to do. And he did it at great personal sacrifice. He wasn't gifted with lands and buildings or facilities to use. There were no benefactors who offered him millions of dollars to build something. He started working to rebuild a little church, brick by brick, stone by stone, with his own hands, to make a place where he and his brothers could worship God. And we see in Francis, and I like to refer to him as Francis, because he was a nobody. He was a loner. And he simply did what he believed was God's will at his own personal cost, with no excuses, no blaming others for not doing this or offering that or supporting this or that. It was his work, and he did it. And now many men join it, but they're not like Francis. They're joining something that's already been built, something that's already been organized. It's not the work that Francis did. The life that Francis lived is different from the life that any Franciscan could ever live. Because Francis built it. He started it. He powered it. And again, he's not a priest. He didn't sign up for a program. He wasn't assigned something by someone and sent with all of the money and supplies that he would need. He started the work from scratch because he believed it was the work that needed to be done. And he offered his life minute by minute, day by day, to fulfill the call to that work. That's what I mean when I talk about being a Christian. A person who sees a problem and solves it. A person who sees a need and takes up the responsibility of satisfying that need at his own personal cost, even if he must do so alone. That's the proof that he truly believes what he says he believes. He believes it so truly that when given a choice to have one thing or that, he chooses that and sacrifices everything for it. That's the proof that he believes what he says he believes. What we find today, and I'm sure that these same people were present all throughout church history when the saints were doing works like Francis. What we find today are conditional Christians. They would do this or that if these conditions existed. They would take up a certain work if it came with a salary. They would pursue a certain work if they were given facilities. They would pursue a certain work if someone organized it for them. Someone got it started for them. Someone did the dirty, humiliating work that it takes to start something. If someone was willing to do that for them, then under those conditions, they would undertake this work. I learned about this spirit when I was in college, and I don't know if I've ever shared this story in the past, but I learned of this by an experience I had when I was in college as a Protestant. There was a Protestant pastor at the church that I attended at the time, and I was a student at Rutgers University, and I was a Christian on the Rutgers campus. I was very evangelistic. I considered my studies and my academic work as a means of evangelizing my professors and fellow students. And I took some leadership of an effort to organize a Christian group on campus at Rutgers University. And so I had to undertake this work as a founder of it, starting from scratch. I had to find out where we could possibly meet. And the university offered rooms in the student centers where student groups could gather. I had to work all those details out. I had to make up posters and put them all over campus. I had to invite people to come to the meetings. I had to lead the meetings when no one showed up, or when one or two people showed up. And I did this week after week. And little by little, more people started to hear about it. Other friends of ours started to hear about it. And we started to finally have a decent and regular group getting together. And I remember the pastor of the church, he came to me one day and told me how he was happy to hear that I was doing the work to organize this group on campus. And then he told me that once I get the group up to a certain size and meeting regularly, then he'll start coming to speak to the group. And it was that experience that made me realize what kind of person this pastor was. He was willing to speak. He was willing to, quote-unquote, minister after all of the ugly, dirty, lonely work was finished. He was willing to come in and be the talker after the group was established. And I remember that experience, and I remember thinking, if you are gifted and wise, and you have something valuable to say to these people, then you should be working to organize this group. And on the other hand, if I'm capable of attracting students, gathering them together because they want to meet with me and the other students that are gathering, if we're able to overcome all of those challenges and do all of that work, then who would be better to speak to the members than those of us who built the group? After all, the existence of the group is a sign that we're serious Christians. And that was one of the first experiences that turned me off to Protestantism. But many Christians are like that. They're willing to do something if it can be made comfortable or if it can be made profitable. If someone else will do the hard work of organizing it, building it, investing in it, sacrificing for it, if someone else will accept all of the humiliating tasks when things are unpopular, when there's no money to be had, there's no applause, there's no success to talk about, it's just grinding, unsuccessful work done in hope, like sowing seed in springtime. When that work needs to be done, there's no one to be found willing to do it, but there's a whole army of people that are ready to jump on board once all of that work is done, when it's time to come in and start claiming some benefits, whether it's social status or financial rewards. And that's what I call pretending to be Christians. Because it's not the Christian work that these people are really interested in. It's not the Christian mission that these people are interested in. They don't consider themselves to be the ones responsible to build and create and produce Christian culture. They imagine themselves as people who will consume Christian culture after someone else produces it. They're not going to take up the study of music and train and practice to become a great Christian musician. They're going to attend the concert if and when someone does that. They're not going to work and invest and build a beautiful church. They're going to come to Mass after the beautiful church has been built. They're not going to study and work to build a Christian curriculum for students to enjoy. They're going to enroll their kids after it's been finished, or they're going to apply for a job as a teacher once that school program begins to turn profits. Their interest is not in the work itself. They're not interested in being the producers of good things in the world. They're not interested in being the light of the world and the salt of the earth. The people who do the work to actually make the world better, to eliminate the problems, to remedy the problems. They're not interested in any of that work. They simply are willing to enjoy the fruits of it after it's been completed, and they imagine that their good taste in Christian culture is real Christianity. But it's not. That taste for Christian culture is not real Christianity. The work that produces Christian culture is the real work of Christianity. The work that Francis did is the work of Christianity. The work that Saint Benedict did is the work of Christianity. The work that the Jesuits did to build Catholic schools in the face of the Protestant Reformation, the work that those men did, the Jesuit missionaries who went into places where Christianity was not, and started churches. That's the work of Christianity. There are many willing to profit off of Christian works or pretend to be virtuous because they would never listen to a secular bit of music, but only Christian music, if someone else produces it. And so we get this religion of consumer culture, where the way that you manifest your belief as a member of this consumer culture is by selecting a certain product to consume. But Christians and Christian culture is to be a culture of producers. When Jesus sent the disciples into the world, he told them, "Go and make disciples." Go and make. When God created Adam and Eve, Adam's job was to work the garden, to tend and keep the garden, to produce the fruit by collaborating with the grace of God. There was no fruit to be had until his work contributed to that potential that God had built into the earth to bring forth the fruits of the earth. Go and make was Christ's command to his disciples. Not go and be, not go and use, not go and buy, but go and make. And we see the apostles doing exactly that, literally going into a world where there is no Christianity and making Christianity to exist. Going into cities where there are no Christian disciples and making disciples out of the people of that city. St. Paul, we see him traveling from city to city in the book of Acts, going into places filled with idolatry, filled with Jewish synagogues, but no Christians. And we see him going and doing the incredible work of making disciples. Go and make, Jesus said. Not go and be, not go and use, not go and buy, but go and make. The work that's required to build things, to make things, to produce things, is the real work. The person who identifies himself as a consumer can only exist in a place where other men have done the work to produce things. There's no such thing as a consumer, really. Besides, the man who can produce what he needs doesn't necessarily need to make any available to anyone else. Even there, the consumer depends on his generosity. As St. Paul commanded the Christians, work that you may share. The man who works that he may share is the producer. He's not a consumer. He's not sharing something someone else produced. The idea of sharing means giving of yours to someone else, not borrowing something from someone else. And in Christian circles, if we were to take 1,000 Christians, how many of them would be producers of Christianity? How many of them would be consumers of Christianity? Or retailers of Christianity? The real work is the work of the producer, the work of the creator, the inventor, the poet, the artist, the scholar. And I don't mean modern academic scholars, I mean true, learned, wise men who for the sake of wisdom do the work of studying, not for the sake of degrees, not for the sake of teaching positions, who do the work for the sake of wisdom herself, work that is unpaid, work that is unseen, study that isn't based on credits and course catalogs, degree requirements, but studies that are required for true wisdom, for which the reward is only wisdom. Those are the true scholars. They work alone, they work in solitude, they work unpaid. They work when no one's watching. They work when everyone else goes to sleep. They work when everyone else is playing. And the result of their studies is the production of all sorts of good things that others merely consume. But if there are no producers, this position of consumer can't even exist. And people shouldn't have the right to think that they can simply choose to be a consumer and leave the production to someone else. Everywhere you can see a problem in our society, there's an opportunity for some Christian to produce the solution. And I'm not talking big, unrealistic things like curing cancer or ending world hunger. We don't even know if these things are possible. I'm talking about everyday problems around us that are certainly within our reach, within our power, that we simply look at and complain about and talk about as if somebody else is supposed to provide the solution. Like a woman who walks around her house complaining about how dirty her house is, about how bad the meals are, not realizing that she's the one whose job it is to clean that house and prepare the meals, as if there's someone else who's supposed to do her work. And many people live like that, complaining about things that need to be done by some imaginary army of workers and producers, an army that doesn't include them. Somehow, they've been appointed judges and observers of the problems in the world. And the easy way to silence them when they're doing their complaining is to simply ask them what they're going to do about it. Because once you ask that question, they have no further interest in the conversation. There are a million problems around us every day. Not problems that are none of our business. For example, like a problem in a liturgical ceremony, which is the business of the clergy, not of the laity. That's none of our business. And only a busybody would have his nose in ecclesiastical affairs pretending to have some real interest there, only because he knows that he'll never be asked to provide the solution. As soon as he's asked to provide some solution, he'll just excuse himself and say, well, that's not my job. That's right. It's not your job. It's none of your business. But if we were to turn around and begin examining his life and all the things around his life in the world, his family, his business, his own personal health, simple things, we'll find all kinds of disorder, all kinds of problems left unaddressed, while he attends to the problems of the church, which are none of his business. And as soon as problems are pointed out in his life, he'll claim that he's just being personally attacked. He'll claim that the people criticizing his life are uncharitable. And he'll begin listing excuse after excuse after excuse for why he can't fix this and why this must be that way and why that must be this way. He'll have an excuse for every question, every problem, there's an excuse. And yet when he looks at someone else's work, there's no room for excuses for anyone else. And this is just a pretender, easily exposed by simply asking him what he's going to do about it. I've heard people complaining about the ugliness of churches. They look at pictures from cathedrals in France or other countries, cathedrals that were built centuries and centuries ago by kings. Kings who made the funding of the construction and maintenance of these cathedrals a national concern. These churches, these cathedrals are often designed and built by the world's greatest masters, men who are producers, often working with no concern for their pay, but often working, considering it an honor to serve and promote the glory of God, while seeking nothing more than a pay that's just to cover their necessary expenses. They don't see it as a business opportunity. And those old cathedrals were built by skills that men had developed in hope of possibly building a cathedral one day. Men didn't build cathedrals for practice. A cathedral wasn't built on every street. Men studied and worked in their everyday work, in their simple work, developing skills. And then when the opportunity came to do something necessary, they undertook that work at great personal cost, often knowing that they would never see the completion of it or receive any credit for the work that they had done. And we look at those great cathedrals and we ignore the costs of them. We ignore the fact that there were armies and armies of skilled workers, men who were content to be glass workers and bricklayers and stone masons. We ignore the fact that all of those men pursued those arts and skills on their own. We lazily look at this finished product, this majestic cathedral, and we say, in idleness, now that's what a church should look like. And we fold up our paper and walk away and imagine that we're the true Christians because we have, quote unquote, good taste. The real work of the Christian is not to approve of what is objectively a beautiful building. The work of the Christian is to build the next church or the next cathedral. not to be the one who stands and gazes at it and approves of it, but the one who takes up one of those jobs that was required for its construction, who designs it, who plans it, who funds it. That's the work of the Christian. Not to attend Mass in it after it's completed, or to look at it and give it a thumbs up. And when you hear a man complaining about how ugly the churches are, the conversation ends very quickly when you ask how much he would be willing to donate to fix it. The discussion is over. Or whether he would be willing to do the work to fix it. Oh, well, I'm not good at that. I don't know how to do that kind of work. Exactly. Exactly. The kind of work that's needed to do the kind of things that you claim to be important is a kind of work that for some reason you chose not to pursue. That's pretending. Pretending to have an interest in something that you're not willing to work for, you're not willing to prepare for, you're not willing to contribute to. That's pretending. What we see all around in Christian circles is pretending, lots and lots of pretending. And as I move towards the end of this talk, I'd like to talk about my own specialty, which is education. When I set out to restore the classical liberal arts curriculum, I had no idea what I was even getting into. I had no idea. I had no idea how much work there would need to be done. I had no idea what I would ever do with it. I just knew that it was something that needed to be done. And I offered myself to be a worker who was willing to give it all that I could give it. It turned out to be far greater a project than I ever estimated. The work is completely overwhelming. The challenges are overwhelming. There are language barriers, there are cultural barriers, there are technological barriers, there are financial barriers. And any one of these barriers or obstacles can become an excuse to quit and just say, oh well, I gave it a shot. But that's not Christian work. And how do I know that if I persevere, God wouldn't allow me to achieve it? Or maybe there's help right around the corner. Maybe there's a 17-year-old boy somewhere who's working up through his own studies, who's going to help me in the future. And all that I needed to do was keep pushing for a few more years, and help would come. I have no idea. But it's that hope that causes me to keep pushing on. And every year, we get one step closer. One more obstacle falls. One more dilemma is solved. One more gap is filled. One more question is answered. And it's gone on that way for 20 years now. Really 25, which is when I started studying the history of classical Catholic education. And when I look around and see what other programs and people in education are doing, I have to admit that it upsets me because they're pretending. They're pretending to be interested in Catholic education But they know that they're ignoring the actual problems. They're ignoring the work that actually needs to be done because they know that if they take a shorter route, there's money to be made. Because people will be content with a lazy imitation or a counterfeit copy. There are thousands and thousands of parents who would be content if we just pretended to be restoring Catholic education. Let's just pretend to do it. Let's take pictures of Thomas Aquinas and put them on the books, and we'll just pretend that we're restoring Catholic education. I see this culture of pretending, and what people don't understand is, we might think, who cares? It's okay. If somebody pretends, they're really not hurting anyone, right? The reality is that they are hurting people. They're hurting two different sets of people. First of all, they're hurting innocent people who simply don't know and are looking for help. They're hurting those people by pretending to know what they're doing. They're hurting those people by pretending to have the answer. Taking money and trust from those people when they know, no matter what they say, they know that what they're doing cannot possibly be what was done by Catholics in the past. By the pictures, by the people who are pictured in and on their books, they know that what they're doing is not what those people did. And they take advantage of the ignorance of thousands and thousands of Catholics who know even less and who trust them. They do harm to those people. And they also do harm to the people who are working to do the real work by distracting attention from the real work, by misleading people away from the solution, and in simple practical terms, by taking resources away from the true work and wasting those resources on counterfeits. They hurt innocent people who are looking for help, and they hurt the true workers who are denied available resources in the Catholic community that could be used to fund these works and actually solve the problems, but instead are being diverted into the pockets of pretenders. And that's upsetting, because things that could take shorter amounts of time, help many, many more people, and allow a renewal to happen sooner, all of that is being pushed back and delayed and hindered by pretenders. Pretenders in education are people who want to wear bow ties, but who don't want to actually study. People who want to be paid as teachers without first devoting the necessary effort and care to studying. People who want to be in front of a crowd speaking, who are not willing to work in solitude. People who are willing to do something for money, but not willing to do the real work when there's no money offered for it. Those are the pretenders. And they're legion today. The real work of Catholic education is first and foremost study. We don't have the wisdom to pretend that we're teachers. We don't have the knowledge that students need. If we're honest, we'll acknowledge that, and we'll realize that what's needed is for us to study, to have a long-term plan. Maybe we'll be able to help when we're 60, but none of us are in position to help at present, unless we're pretenders and we're not really helping but just pretending to have something that we don't actually have. Even if that requires us to lie and make things up, like telling students we're using the Socratic method when we're not. Or telling students that throughout history men studied the great books when they didn't. What Christianity needs, what the world needs, are real Christians willing to do real Christian work and not mere pretenders. Pretenders, what they do doesn't work. They all get exposed. All of their works collapse. Because little by little, the people doing the real work reveal. They reveal the phony pretender's works over time. And as soon as that happens, those pretenders are exposed and their work begins to crumble. A good example of this is how Laura Berquist chose to promote a Protestant idea of education as classical education among Catholic families, started a whole study program, advertised it everywhere as the restoration of classical Catholic education, and the whole thing is a fraud. The whole thing is a fraud. And I know she knows better. And that's the kind of thing being done in many different places, in many different areas, where pretenders have occupied their places until real Christians come and put them down, get them out of the way so that their distractions can stop, so that the innocent people who are looking for help, who need instruction, which is a work of mercy, not a market niche. We need real Christian workers who are willing to do the real work, who can expose all the pretenders, create and produce real solutions to problems, and actually help people, not just Christians but the world in general, and most importantly, who can glorify God by revealing the truth in all of these different areas so that God can be praised and glorified, not embarrassed and associated with nonsense. So many problems lie around you on every side. Things you probably complain about, problems you point out, but who's going to actually solve them? Things you complain you wish you had, but why is it someone else's job to do the work to make them available for you? If you see the problems, why not offer yourself to be the one willing to work and sacrifice and help produce the solution? Be a real Christian. in your generation. Maybe you don't have the resources or whatever is required to solve some great problem. Then be content to solve some lesser problem, because if you can solve a lesser problem, that may contribute in the long term to the solution of the greater problem. And if you can't solve the greater problem, don't use that as an excuse to solve no problem. Find a problem you can solve and be the one who solves it by your own personal sacrifice and work and study, and persevere until it's solved, and have something to offer God as a sign of your work, a fruit of the grace that He's made available to you to work with. Find a problem, and instead of complaining about it as if that's anything, find a problem and be the solution. Be the Christian in this generation who turns dark things into light, who fixes what's broken. Think of the peace prayer of St. Francis and be the person who can offer that prayer, not while you ignore all of the opportunities around you to do those things, but as you do those things. Those are the kinds of Christians that the world needs, especially today. It's not the government's job to solve the problems, even though you could go jump in with all of the angry, frustrated political Christians who are just making excuses, just pretending. Be the solution. That's why you were called as a layman. That's your purpose in this life, is to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God, to illuminate and order temporal affairs according to God's will. The clergy is responsible for the sacramental life of the church and its ceremonies. The laymen are responsible for all of the problems outside the church in the world. Those problems are our responsibility. And instead of complaining that those problems exist, get to work and solve them. And don't be a pretender.